We're here with Dr. Richard T. Rodríguez, Professor of English and Media and Cultural Studies here at UC Riverside. He was born and raised in Southern California. He's also a DJ here at KUCR. Dr. Ricky on the Radio is on every Thursday, 3 to 5 p.m. His new book is A Kiss Across the Ocean, Transatlantic Intimacies of British Post-Punk and U.S. Latinidad. So, Dr. Ricky, so tell us about this new book. What is it about, and what is Transatlantic Intimacies of British Post-Punk and U.S. Latinidad?
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you for having me. So I guess a brief summary of what the book is about is the mutual influences between British post-punk artists, musicians, and their Latinx fan base in the United States since the 1980s. The subtitle Transatlantic Intimacies of British Post-Punk and U.S. Latinidad is a way to try to capture this mutual influence, the way that there's an inspiration and a motivation that happens in a multi-directional fashion. I think, for the longest time, a number of journalists have written about the Latino fandom of Morrissey, the former Smiths lead singer. And a lot of these journalists were intent on cracking the code as to why Latinos were drawn to Morrissey. Was it because of an inherent sentimentality that was part of Latino culture that easily latched on to the lyrics of Morrissey, the kind of somber, downtrodden, scenarios that he creates in his music? What was it? And for me, it was more about thinking of how this music from the UK has a much more profound influence rather than trying to figure out what the essentialized notions are that draw Latinos to this music in the first place. And I was thinking about my mom, growing up as a teenager in Southern California and who just loved the Beatles. And so it seemed to me that there was this long-standing connection between Latinos in the U.S. and British popular music. And I wanted to, kind of tease that out and to try to make sense of my own attachment to these musicians from the 1980s when I was a teenager. And in doing, in writing this book, in doing the research, I soon discovered that this influence ran both ways. And so a lot of these musicians would come to the United States and encounter Latinos here, and that would inspire various musical collaborations, song lyrics, the way that they understood Latino culture and history. And so really what the book is about is thinking about these connections, these longstanding connections between British musicians, many of whom are from working class backgrounds, and their Latino fan base in the United States who also come from a similar economic class background as well. And in writing the book, it was really fascinating to discover what these connections were. And it also allowed me to talk about just my own personal attachment to this music that started as a preteen and continues into my years as a middle-aged adult.
Cool. Yeah, and there are a number of academics who write about punks and related subcultures, and some of it's good and some of it is not as good. And so can you tell us about your connection to the music and the community, outside of academia?
Sure. Yeah. I have to admit that when I first started writing the book, I was trying to create a more distanced approach where it was more of like a scholarly focus on this music. And fortunately, I have a really good friend and colleague here at UCR who teaches in creative writing, who identified a footnote in one of my chapter drafts that was kind of a personal, account of my attachment to this music. And he demanded that I remove it from the footnote and put it into the body of the text. And I'm glad he did that because it allowed me to really focus on, why I had a personal investment in this music and what my connections to it were in a way that interrupted that very, distant scholarly approach that I think people assume that they have to have in order to be taken seriously. And so what I wanted to do in the book was to weave together elements of memoir with cultural history. And a lot of this meant talking about my own personal connections to the music, to the artists, going to concerts, meeting various singers of groups that I write about, like Holly Johnson of the band Frankie Goes to Hollywood, going to a concert and having, the fortuitous opportunity to be moved from the back of the venue to the second row and touching a singer like Mark Allman when he reaches into the audience. And so I think all of those personal memoirs, all those personal anecdotes are really important as far as allowing me to talk about what my investment is in this music, so that it's not just this objective perspective, but it's really one that again highlights the intimacy that exists between myself and these artists, and then also the intimacy that I think is established between these artists and the fans who are drawn to their music for various reasons. Oftentimes they overlap with my own connections, and I think this has been made clear since the book's been out, where people will come up to me and say, that's exactly my experience too. Thank you for making me feel seen and shedding light on, why I'm so in love with this music. And I've been in love with it for decades now. And so, that's pretty much it.
Cool. So who do you see as the intended audience of the book, or who did you write it for?
Yeah, I have to say, I initially imagined this as a book for people like myself who grew up in the 1980s and who were listening to this music, going to concerts and seeing these bands that I originally saw in the 1980s and seeing them now, and then looking into the audience and kind of spying people who were kind of, once, certain, dressed in a certain way, and they're now middle-aged and they look totally different from what they looked like as a teenager. And I could identify with them. And so I thought, I bet if I was to write this book that they would have a connection to it and they'd be able to relate to this music. And so I have to say that the intended audience was not an academic audience, but rather a more non-academic audience who was similarly drawn to this music, and an academic audience was really only second to the intended audience, which is more general and people that I would encounter at concerts and in some of the most random places, and some of my really close friends who still listen to this music, and we talk about maybe driving from one place to another with a tape in the deck of Culture Club or the Pet Shop Boys or Bauhaus or Susie and the Banshees. And so in many ways writing this book was for them, and to remind them of, the connection that we have with respect to this music. It's cool that academics are reading the book, and I hope they get something out of it. But it's more important to me that people who are non-academics are reading it and relating to it and finding something useful and pleasurable about it.
Yeah, because that's cool, because it's on Duke University Press and also Rough Trade. That's a very uncommon connection.
Yeah, I have to say that one of the great things about the press, Duke University Press, is that they're interested in disseminating ideas beyond an academic context, and it was really cool when Rough Trade New York wanted to sell the book, and they asked me to sign nameplates for people to buy autographed copies. And I don't know, it's really heartening to see that the book, even though it has its university press roots, is also stemming into or kind of growing into different circles that are non-academic, including record stores. I have a cousin who works at a music store in Orange County, and he told me that people are coming in and buying the book, and that makes me really happy.
Sweet, yeah. So at the moment, who or what band are you listening to right now?
I have to say, I still listen to the bands that I'm writing about in the book, or who don't make it into the book, but I listen to alongside the artists who I do write about. So recent albums by Altered Images and Simple Minds, for example, the Specials. But I'm also interested in kind of this emergent group of post-punk bands coming out of Britain, like Shame, Black Midi, and other groups that the Young Fathers, who are kind of fusing this post-punk style with hip-hop and trip-hop and dance music. And it's really exciting to see a younger generation of musicians who are listening to the music that I write about in the book and then also translating that sound for a more contemporary context.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. McKee, for being here in the studio and your book, A Kiss Across the Ocean. And you can get it. You can check it out at your local bookstore or ask your local library to order it.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, Elliot.
Thank you, Dr. Ricky.
Thank you.